Is this maybe the start of the journey? Have I maybe gone through that barrier, found out the problems, ironed them out, and now about to hit back with a swift right hook with Jack's Chats 2? Who knows? I don't know.
Dear listeners, we are gathered here today to reflect on a podcast that is no longer with us, Jack's Chats. It was the podcast that challenges your thinking, inspires creativity, and unlocks the secrets to standing out online. Haunting us today is its host, Jack Gaisford. Launched in July 2023, 8 episodes were published in total before the show was left to perish just 2 months later. On this episode, we'll learn what caused Jack's Chats to be yet another headstone in the podcast graveyard. We'll celebrate the highs, lament the lows, and discuss whether it should be laid to rest forever or be brought back to life. From One Fine Play, this is Podcast Graveyard. Hi Jack, thanks for haunting the show today.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
So tell me, why did you want to make the podcast?
I started the podcast as a way to highlight my expertise, to showcase the sort of network that I had, to talk to other business owners and marketers and heads of companies about marketing and content and video and social media.
And what shows did you take inspiration from?
I wanted to do a podcast for years, and I think I never really had the time to do it. The business went through a bit of a slower period, so I thought, this is going to be an amazing opportunity to actually start what I wanted to do and get the podcast off. I had all my mics ready and everything sorted out. And I'd seen a few people post some stuff, but it was more snippets. Obviously, I do like Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO. I think it's a great podcast. I love Joe Rogan's show. There's a few there. I saw a bit of inspiration, and then I just thought, I'm going to give it a go. And here we are today on Podcast Graveyard. So yeah.
What was it that you were expecting to achieve?
I presumed that I would post maybe a season of a podcast, maybe get up to, I don't know, a couple of hundred downloads, maybe 1,000 downloads an episode, which would be cool because my network size through the business is, upwards of probably 50 and a bit thousand. So I thought, maybe 0.5% of those people would maybe engage, and didn't quite work out like that.
How long do you think you spent making the podcast?
Considering that it wasn't an online thing, so we fully went out of our way to go to people in their space, so it was convenient for them. We didn't want to waste their time, but we wanted their expertise and camera. Very, very busy people. We had, global head of marketing of Lego. We had big CEOs that running multi-million-pound global businesses. And so we traveled to London, we traveled all over the UK to film these podcasts and to capture certain bits. I think towards the end, we started to do it in our own studio because it was just a bit more convenient to do at the cost of maybe an inconvenience for the people that were on the show. We were probably spending upwards of 4 or 5 hours traveling, an hour or two filming, a day or two editing, a day planning. So you're talking probably a week's worth of time in consolidation per episode. So a huge time investment.
That's massive.
Yeah, mate, it's huge.
Especially early on. I guess that comes from your experience of making good quality content. And Jack's Chats are amazing quality content. This is one of the things that fascinates me about it being in the graveyard is technically they're great pieces of audio and video.
I appreciate that.
Last time we had a memorial, it was for a show called Sam Talks Technology, and the ghost of that podcast, Sam, he talked about the idea of go ugly early, which was to get started by not investing too much in kit and too much time and just start making and learning and evolving. I guess one of the challenges when you know what you're doing, it's a blessing and a curse. You invested all of that time, the reward early days was low. And that's probably a contributing factor to why we're here today.
Yeah, 100%. I also think there's an area here of reputation and professional credibility, not to toot my own horn, but I'm known for producing some quality stuff. I don't want to then release stuff that is subpar to that brand, that personal brand, that what I'm known for. But at the same time, mate, it's just such a huge time investment. I think we went in very unknowingly into how long it takes to do that sort of stuff. Again, which is why we're here now.
Were you focusing on the video element or the audio element? Because you were making a podcast, but it sounds like you were really making that commitment to make videos.
Yes, so it was the way that we were doing it was that it was predominantly for video, for short form content. The podcast was just a byproduct of what we could create and strip from that longer form conversation. My instant thoughts were, cool, it's a nice long form video that we can cut up and we can also strip back and put the audio version on Spotify and Apple Music and et cetera, et cetera. But the predominant version was for video. But in terms of actually focusing on audio quality, well, not even necessarily the quality, but just the format of that experience probably wasn't really a concern of mine. It was more trying to get... I was almost scripting these podcasts to ask certain things that would elicit a certain reaction that I could use for a short form piece of content. So again, it wasn't set into how you professionally do them, which is why you're great at what you do, and you break it down into chapters and you tell that narrative and you really craft that story, which is going to increase retention. It's going to hold people's engagement. Mine was very much focused on question, answer, slight discussion. Question, answer, slight discussion. That's kind of the format. But very quickly, you can see people's retention drop. You can see people aren't as engaged. The viewer rating just doesn't go any higher than maybe the first 10, 20 minutes, maybe a push, because there's nothing that's changing. There's nothing that's a pattern interrupt. There's no re-engagements in that format. So yeah, so the approach to auditory was not thought through, and it was predominantly focused on short form content to elicit certain social responses.
So you approached it as a video, if we're honest. A byproduct output was the fact you could strip the audio and put it on Spotify or...
Yeah, 100%. I think the video standpoint was where a lot of our energy went into. I wanted to make sure that it looked amazing, that people could see that we knew what we were doing. But yeah, that's why we're here.
How much money do you think you put into it? Because it sounds like you went hard on the time side, so you weren't messing around.
Yeah, 100%. So again, luckily, we had all of the kit, because we create content for clients, right? So we're going to have the professional mics and the cameras and the lights and all those cool things. In terms of physical money, maybe a couple of £100, maybe. In terms of time, a week per episode, probably you're thinking 8 weeks, 2 months. 20 grand, maybe 25 grand agency time, if not a bit more.
Big investment.
Huge. Yeah, a couple of grand an episode, probably.
Especially if you work out the value of all that time and the other stuff you could have done with it and the creative energy that goes around it and all the rest of it.
Yeah, 100%.
What was the biggest obstacle you faced in making the podcast?
Time to produce, time to plan, time to edit. Not so much ideas, not so much getting guests. We had 50 people that wanted to, as soon as I mentioned it, people were like, yes, 100% have me on. So we had a list of people, which was great. I then aggregated those people based on how well I think they perform on the podcast. But it was the time to do it. It's an arbitrary cost, but it's the cost of the team's time to edit that content, to travel up with me, to set up cameras, to physically film that content, to back it up and color it and put it all together. That costs money. And if it's not being spent on client stuff, it's got to be spent on our stuff that is generating some form of income. Podcasts, from my experience in those 2 months that I was making those episodes, didn't do that. It died because I just didn't have the time to do it. It was very much a me thing. And I think for me to spend, upwards, and again, it's an arbitrary number, but £2,000-3,000 for an episode in terms of agency time on me didn't make sense. So we decided to pull the trigger and put it into something else.
It's really interesting that you mentioned time and that the cost was in the labor and the time, because you have those skills in-house. You become super conscious of investing them. And it sounds like you were very much making this show with a business head on. The passion was to help drive revenue. You wanted results. And I guess there was always going to be that thing of like, can we sustain this for long enough before it returns results? Podcasting is not a discovery platform. It's not a conversion platform. It's a brand build over a long period of time, allows for that real deep engagement. And for many people, it's a way that they can tell another part of their story or personality to build more deep relationships. And there's that whole challenge of how do you keep it going for long enough? I mean, the industry average is about 7 episodes before people quit, and you got to 8. It is a lot to do with being able to sustain your resources. You also raise an interesting point in what you were saying, which is not the first time that a show has made it to the graveyard for this challenge, but it feels like you made this show very much to meet the guest, not necessarily so much with the audience in mind.
100%. Would agree.
You wanted to have a conversation and build rapport with someone you could invite onto the show to garner business relations with further down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Digging a little deeper on that, it sounds like you probably weren't getting the returns, because if you were seeing a return, you probably would have continued spending the money, because it sounds like you were using it as a marketing vehicle. And not wanting to give you too hard a time, because this is a memorial and an emotional experience for you. And we'll come onto this in a second, but like the marketing of the show, it feels like this was an opportunity to open up conversations with people, and potentially you keep doing that. And then on episode 9, the person says, actually, I'd like to give you a £3 million contract. Well, suddenly the £2,000 an episode doesn't seem very expensive. Also, if you had £2,000 an episode to invest in it, then you could have probably outsourced that to somebody if you were seeing the results.
Yeah.
So I guess there is an element of a lack of results. Is that right?
100%. Yeah, 100%. Obviously, we live in a world where people need things fast. And again, from a cost point of view, from a team point of view, if that wasn't generating some form of results, and I would qualify that as new leads, inquiries, new business, new customers, not necessarily views and those sorts of things, then it doesn't make sense to do that. If we started to see some real benefits, and maybe that some of those relationships were really getting nurtured heavily into that kind of business stage where you're starting to talk about deals and contracts and those sorts of things, I would have given it more of my attention to invest into properly and sink some actual money into to really push. But after 8 episodes, so after, let's just say it took a week to do in per episode, you're doing 8 weeks of work to see no tangible results in terms of leads, business, and your cash in the bank, etc. didn't make sense.
What happened when it came to marketing? You made clips of it, which you posted across your social platforms where you already have reach. What else did you do to market the show?
Nothing. It was just clips. That was it.
What's your learnings from that?
Don't just post clips. I think, again, it requires attention. It requires an investment of your time to properly, think through. There was no strategy. There was no distribution plan. There was no business plan for that podcast. It was very much, Jack's had a new thought. I'd love to do this. Let's just go for it and launch it into the world. And I think very similar to what you mentioned earlier, James. You mentioned there was a guy who talked about sort of releasing his first version, working it through there. That was kind of my way of going all out, seeing if that first kind of iteration works, even though it was at a higher level, to see how you can iterate it and tweak it and sort of make it perform better in the future. But marketing was not really a thought. It was more of the content itself as a byproduct, and it can be used to market and drive traffic to the full episode. But actually, do people on TikTok who maybe be interested in marketing or just scrolling through at 9 p.m. at night, see a short form bit of content that's 15 seconds that's like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm now going to go sit down and consume an hour-long podcast and go to a completely different... I don't know if it works like that.
I think there's something to be said for opening up your heart to understanding that it might not be about consumption of the full-length episode. There's lots of value in people just consuming clips. Maybe you've got people who are a fan of the show who've never listened to a full-length episode but have watched 30 or 40 clips and seen lots of the most valuable moments and taken lots from it and now perceive you as someone of influence from just watching 60 seconds here and 60 seconds there. I think that's something that lots of creators don't consider. There's such a judgment in the podcast space around how many downloads did you get, that halo effect is sometimes not taken into account. Sounds like that was something that was actually really powerful for you.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Again, the redistribution of those short form videos were brilliant. You know, a 6-figure views, which is great. Again, and an amalgamation of those ratings, right? That's got to do something for brand presence and for reputational increase and maybe a bit of brand advocacy. Marketing my expertise. That's great, but it's at that early stage. It's an intangible metric that I can't track. I can't track if someone now trusts me more. I can't track if the same person on TikTok is consuming all of my content and is now a big advocate of my business. It's all very, again, it's not necessarily arbitrary, but I just can't tangibly see those figures. If there was a way to measure that, maybe I could.
There is a real challenge in podcasting with attribution, knowing the impact of your audio, but that's why you really have to think of it as a brand build. And it is one of those things where consistency at scale and finding a model that you can sustain for a long enough period will end up paying off. Bringing this back to learnings from the podcast, what would you say is the worst decision you made when making the podcast?
Oh, that's a great question. It's also the biggest plus, and I think it was maybe the production value of it. I think spending that much time on an episode, even though reputationally it aligned with where I want to be as a brand, as a personal brand, people saw it was quality, people felt that it was going to be great value because it was at that sort of level. At the same time, it was a huge hindrance because it just took too long to do. Traveling for, let's just say, 4 hours to do a podcast episode is half a day. That's a huge amount of time. And again, the opportunity costs that were probably lost in that were huge.
Especially for something that's unproven at the time. It's a big commitment.
100%.
And conversely, what good decisions did you make about the podcast, but just a little bit too late? Things that you wish you had seen sooner?
The narrative of that format. So actually, how do you tell a story? How do you keep people engaged? How do you make sure it's not just another question-answer discussion format? It's a real deep dive. It's a real breakdown sort of vibe. Nicheness of guests as well. I love all of them. Some fit more than others in terms of the, big business owners, lots of credibility in that sort of space. Some people maybe more up and coming.
On guests, did you see a correlation between the social reach or the status of the guest and the consumption of the episode?
You know what? Not so much. I really thought that was going to be the case. So we tried to have a big, diverse range of people. Again, we had people from Lego. We had the biggest VFX artist in the UK, Brandon Bayham. I think his last name was. Really cool people, and you've got people ranging from maybe 5,000 followers on social, some in the hundreds, to some who have 10 plus million followers on social. Really big, engaged networks. I think a lot of it comes down to, were they actively sharing that podcast? No. So their audience would have had to have known me, or I would have had to do some very, very clever searchability work and getting that in terms of keywords and getting the names on those podcasts for that to be searched by their audience as well. We did have one episode by Brandon, I think, posted it. It got, I think, like 20,000 views in an hour, which is cool. But again, his audience are not the people that would engage with that sort of post. So it was whether it was the quality of that, which probably wasn't where it needed to be.
I think that's a really interesting learning, especially if you're going to lean on guests to try and drive marketing efforts, are the audience of the guest remotely interested in the thing that you're talking about, which quite often the answer is no. Mm-hmm. So did you mourn the passing of the podcast? Are you kind of relieved to see it die?
That's another great question. Mourning's maybe not the word. I feel a bit sad that it kind of, part of me feels like I didn't give it my all. So there's a bit of resentment in it, a little bit. I wish I could have found the time. It's a matter of priority and what is most important. I wish I had found the time for it. Part of me is glad that I don't now do it because it was so much time. And I've been able to spend it in areas much better than commuting for that long in terms of what it gave in terms of results. Whether I mourn it, that might be slightly further down the line. We'll see. But yeah, I definitely maybe resent not giving it everything and properly going for it,
On that note, if you were to do things differently, where would you focus more energy?
One would be marketing. One would be the overarching storytelling of that podcast. And I think thirdly would be the types of guests and their network that they have to be able to use as leverage. There's a few things, but definitely marketing is one of the biggest.
From everything that you've learned, what piece of advice would you give to a podcaster just about to start making their first episode?
Best of luck. Absolutely go for it. I think just be aware.
Amazing.
Yeah, just be aware that things, as they do everywhere in life, they just take longer than you think they're going to take. So if you've got the mindset of quick wins, 3 to 6 months, you're going to be absolutely rolling in the dosh, living it up in the Maldives in your Lambo. Can't imagine that's going to happen even after 6 years of running my business. That still hasn't happened yet. I can't imagine from a podcast that you post once a week or once a month that's going to quite do the same. But I think it's, I wish the best luck. It's an amazing opportunity to learn a lot about yourself, a bit of personal development, to test new things out. And I think also just to have a bit of respect for the people that do it professionally. I think only when you really give it your all and you really get in the trenches with it, do you realize how hard it really is. So my hat is off to all of the people that run and manage and build those professional podcasts for a living, because it's very, very, very tough. So best of luck. That's what I'd say.
I love that. Probably my favourite answer to that question that anyone has given. Out of interest, did you enjoy being a podcast host?
Loved it. Yeah, absolutely loved it. I love talking to people. I love learning about people's journeys. I take a lot of learnings from just talking to where people have come from, what they've learned, what they've made mistakes on. It helps me in business as well and just general life. I think it's, maybe admire certain people. It's maybe build very strong relationships with people as well, which is great. And also, I think you've got to have things in your day-to-day and, in your working week that just brings you that little bit of joy as well. Sometimes it can be very hard in business and, whatever you do. And sometimes you need those little things to look forward to. For me, the podcast was one of those things on a Thursday. I'm like, I can't wait to talk to this person about this and just find out a bit of information. And I always used to, with my creative director there as well, we always used to come off on a high, chat about what we've learned from it, what we can tweak in our business models that, this successful person's done for theirs. So it gave us some really good learnings. But yeah, it was, I loved doing it. Absolutely loved it.
If your podcast had a headstone, what would you put on it?
Failed and failed fast.
Right. I think that's very apt. As we bring this memorial to a close, I think it's time to have a look at whether the podcast should be resurrected or be sent to a heavenly afterlife. And as we've been talking, there's a few things that really stand out to me. I think the first is that you're a great presenter, you're a great host, and you've got a great knack for being able to deliver a compelling story. But I also feel like for this podcast, I think what you did was you came up with a marketing vehicle and labeled it podcast because you didn't know what else to label it. In this whole story, you never talk about really the listener. You didn't do anything to really tell listeners. You didn't really make it for the listeners. Even during this conversation, when I pointed out about the listeners, you then continued to just talk about guests, wanting to find more guests, building a relationship with guests, reaching out to them, all that stuff. And I think there's an element of podcasting which allows you to do that. But I am fairly confident that's not where you should be focusing your energy if you want to make a great show. There are two stakeholders in a podcast, you and the listeners. They're the only people who turn up every week. And so focusing on those two people and how you're going to deliver as much value as you can to the listener and understanding why the listener's going to turn up again is going to help you with growth and the results that you are ultimately, I guess, trying to look for. Although there's a conflict in there because the result that you really want is more deep relationships with people who will potentially become clients. So for me, I think that there absolutely is a future in the podcast, but I think what you would be best off doing is understanding what you're trying to achieve and changing the style so you can, in your eyes, compromise on the quality. Maybe record online, maybe record in bulk, maybe create a different format that allows you to be more creatively free so that the high production value, especially in the actual recording segment, is not as heavy, shall we say, or a much tighter script that means a much faster editorial, edit and post. Because what you really want is that FaceTime in the room. I would be really interested to know, and we don't know this, but how many of those guests ever listened to the podcast, ever checked back, ever even know that it got posted? I actually know, anecdote here, of a client that we worked with, who shall absolutely remain nameless, who came to me once and said, I want to start a podcast. I have no intentions of posting it. I just want to get in front of potential customers. And he created a podcast and he would meet people and he would record the episodes, and that would be that. It just sat on a hard drive. No one ever checked. And he built all these relationships and off he went. It's basically exactly the same or very similar motivations to the ones you have. So I think that your motivations don't necessarily align with a podcast. I think you should continue doing what you were doing to build relationships with people, but I just don't know whether you should call it a podcast.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely.
You're burdened by production value, but your motivations aren't for the person consuming the content.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's the time is the one thing that let me down massively. If I could figure out a way to make it more efficient, because I did enjoy it, I would consider reviving it from the podcast graveyard.
I really appreciate you talking to me today and sharing your experiences of making a podcast and being open to discussing its end with the world. Hopefully it's been a valuable experience. It's some food for thought.
Yeah, 100%. I think takeaways for anybody listening to this podcast, because you are now my priority above everything else. I hope that you've learned from my experience. I hope you don't make the same mistakes, but at the same time, I kind of hope that you do, because I think you've got to go on that journey, and I think you've got to see it to believe it, put it into action, get in the trenches, make those failures, and then learn from them, iterate, rinse, repeat, keep doing it, stay consistent, and ultimately you will do better than I did. I just gave up a little bit too early, I think. But is this maybe the start of the journey? Have I maybe gone through that barrier, found out the problems, ironed them out, and now about to hit back with a swift right hook with Jack's Chats 2? Who knows? I don't know.
Jack, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
No worries, mate. Thanks for having me on.